This is Eric for Z1UG with the QSO Today podcast. Before we start this episode, I was informed this week of the passing of Jim Stafford, W4QO, who became a silent key after a long bout with cancer. Jim was my guest on episode 120 in November of 2016. I included a link to this interview at the top of this week's show notes page. Jim was a mentor and friend to many hams during his over 50 years in amateur radio. May Jim's memory be for a blessing. QSO Today, episode 385, Chip Lohman, NN4U. My thanks to Icom America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4 Zulu 1 Uniform Golf, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo is coming back on March 12th and 13th. If you'd like to volunteer to help moderate presentations or answer questions about our VFairs platform as an official greeter, then please apply by clicking on the button on the show notes page or on the email that comes out every week to announce the episode. Your help will make the expo a success. I announced in the last episode that I had added a searchable list of contributors to QSO Today on the weekly show notes page. It lists the cumulative contributions since 2014, ranked by total amount. If you have made contributions and are listed, it is because you gave me permission to publicly thank you. If you are not listed but wish to be, then please contact me and I can change the flag on the list. Unfortunately, Buy Me a Coffee does not have an interface to allow me to pull information and list you yet. This is a work in progress. No matter what, I greatly appreciate your support of all of my QSO Today efforts. Chip Lohman, NN4U, was introduced to amateur radio during an early stint as a U.S. Marine stationed next to an Army Mars station. Fascinated by the technology that could connect him to his family around the world, Chip got his first license. NN4U has reinvented himself a few times over in his career, and he tells this story in this QSO Today. NN4U, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Chip?
4Z1UG, NN4U. Hi, Eric. Chip here.
Chip, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, it started in 1978. I'm somewhat of a late bloomer compared to your other guests. I was 27 by then. I was assigned with the Marines to the island of Okinawa, Japan for a year. As you would imagine, back then we didn't have cell phones and text, and there was still something called long-distance charges. And so with my wife, with her folks in Texas and me on the other side of the world, we found out about MARS, the Military Auxiliary Radio System, and used that to communicate. And for anybody in your listening audience not familiar with how the phone patches work, you basically wire in a switch in parallel with the phone and the push-to-talk of the radio, so you can direct an otherwise simplex conversation two ways.
It was a pretty manual system in those days, as I recall. It was simplex, not duplex. But let's go back even further, Chip. Did you have an interest in electronics or radio or anything like that even before you were in the Marines?
The only claim I can make to a radio history, Eric, was the little single-diode rocket radio that you needed to find a ground for, and then you could listen to AM stations.
That was a crystal set.
Yes, but like I think all of us in the hobby, we all have an interest in opening things up and finding out how they work. But I had none of that in electronics. I had taken apart my first car and built a motorcycle, but my Mars experience in 78 was my first exposure to the world of electronics and radio.
What was the hometown?
No hometown. I grew up in the Air Force, so we moved around.
You're an Air Force brat.
Yes, exactly. 3 different high schools and all that kind of stuff.
were those assignments that your father was in the Air Force?
He was. I was born in Rio, which was an interesting consequence. When I turned 18, I got a letter. By then I was at Bandon High School in California, and we got a letter in the mail saying, "Welcome to the Brazilian Army." So we had to do a little backstroke and run up to the capital city of Sacramento and sort that out. And then I went back to Brazil for 65, 6, and 7. That was my experience when other folks were learning about infield fly rules and football. I was playing soccer and volleyball in Brazil.
So you're a Portuguese speaker?
I am more of a Portuguese listener, but I do understand it and spoke it for some years. But as far as my early years, building surfboards in Brazil, pulling things apart, which I think is an interest we all share. But not until, graduated from Kansas University in 73, and then on to the Marine Corps. And then by the time 78 rolled around, I was headed for Okinawa.
How long were you there in Rio de Janeiro?
3 years. I left there in time to come back to the States for my junior year in high school. So this was the time when the Beatles had landed, when the Ford Mustang was first introduced, and we learned everything about the world through the cover of Life magazine.
Did your father have a Ford Mustang?
No. I don't think he even owned a car. There was no base in Rio. It was called a mission, where the Air Force officers shared offices with the Brazilian Air Force officers. And so we lived off the economy. It was a tough job, Eric. My front window of the apartment overlooked Copacabana Beach, but somehow I suffered through that time.
I can only imagine. Although it's my understanding all the rich people were in Leblon.
Leblon is that, and Arpoador and the girl from Ipanema were all within walking distance.
Okay, so you come back to America. You finish high school here. Then you went on to the University of Kansas. What did you major in?
My undergraduate work was degrees in education and psychology. I had plans to be a teacher. And when my first job offer in Eudora, Kansas was going to be, I think, $11,000 a year, a quick pencil and paper of a budget said I'd probably going to be a hard time supporting a family on that. And I went on into the Marine Corps. And as you recall, that time frame in 73 was at the height of Vietnam protest, et cetera. And so I had to make a decision of what service. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not ashamed of it. I could have gone into the Air Force like my dad, but that would have been ROTC, wearing a uniform on campus. I asked my older brother, who was already in the Marine Corps, about their programs, and it was all done during the summer. So for not the most patriotic reasons, I chose the Marine Corps to go off to summer training rather than do it on campus during the 4 years I was at KU. And then fast forward, 15, 16 years later, I got a master's in systems management from Denver University while I was still active duty.
Okay, well, anybody that knows me knows that we don't allow fast forward on the QSO Today podcast.
Oh.
But what I'm interested in is I remember that time, and I missed the lottery by 1 year. I think it ended in 75, and I think it ended the month before I turned 18. That wasn't a time that people were going into the military. But it seems to me that not only did you go into the military, but you also went into the Marines, and you just explained why you didn't go into the Air Force. But was it because you were familiar with the military life growing up in it that seemed appealing to you? And as a person with a degree, did that make a difference in terms of how you went into the Marines?
Well, it's certainly, my family life certainly raised military as one of the options. I had plans on being a teacher. I had a little exposure to that in school. I did a year in a Montessori elementary school and another year at a regular public elementary school. I had been a lifeguard, taught swimming to young kids. So teaching was an early interest. But the military was something everybody in my family, Eric, my grandfather, my mother, both of my brothers, all spent some time in the military. So that was a natural choice. But at the time in 73, I thought, well, I'll just do my 3 years and then move on. And I'm not allowed to fast forward, but we'll talk about that later. But the degree got me a guaranteed contract as an aviator. And So I went into the Marine Corps thinking I was going to be a pilot someday, like my dad. I got to basic training in Quantico, Virginia, and all the talking about maneuver warfare and infantry, I got the sense that pilots weren't the main focus here. And so I remember this clearly. I went down the hall to my company commander and asked him if it was possible to forfeit my aviation guarantee to become an infantryman. And he literally jumped from his desk, ran down the hall yelling, "I got one." I guess that didn't happen very often going from air to ground. I guess it was normally the other way around.
It's interesting here in Israel, the kids here want to be infantry. I mean, pilots, that's the prestige position, but most of the kids don't think that they're going to get there. It's interesting that the kids here all want to be infantry.
May I share a perspective on that? A little bit of fast forward. Later in my career, I was at Command and Staff College where we host foreign officers from different countries. And I can tell you that Israelis were the most focused, the most serious, because we all assumed they were going to take what they learned and return back to a fighting situation. They were the most focused students of the group.
Their military units end up being business partners generally. So you'll find a lot of companies here where the management were all in the same military unit.
Interesting. I did not know that.
So let's get back to you. Okay, so what happened after that?
I end up in the Marine Corps, newly wed to my high school best friend. We were delayed for a couple months on what they call a baby chit. Pam was pregnant at the time I graduated in the summer of 74. And so we hung around the school for a couple months until she had delivered and was healthy, and traveled out to California. My first duty station was Camp Pendleton, California. And I was this is interesting. These interviews cause all of us, I guess, to remember things we had forgotten. I was always in the field as an infantryman. And we went back years later, 20, 25 years later, when I was employed by a company in Silicon Valley. And when we got back to Pendleton, I couldn't recognize the house because I was never there during the daylight. Pam had to point out where the kids learn how to ride bikes and all that kind of stuff. But the infantry is a field unit. One carryover into amateur radio. I don't know if you've had this experience where things that happened at the time seem fairly insignificant, and then you look back in your rearview mirror and you find out what a key role they played in your resume. Have you run into that? Yeah. Well, for me, I look back fondly at all the time we spent in the field with VHF line of sight radios that were battery operated, were generally at half power, running up and down the hills. Wet leaves interfered with the signal. And we learned how to communicate without iPads or sharp devices. You had to build a situational awareness as a picture in your head. And now that I'm in Mars doing net controls and things like that, that skill has stayed with me, where you could see a variety of things going on in your head without depending on all the tools that we have nowadays. And it also taught me to be very succinct, because if you had a little break in successful VHF communications, you had to get the message across quickly while the line was up, so to speak.
Are you a paper map guy, or do you use Waze?
Oh, I am a map. I have maps all over I have maps and globes all over my shack, probably, as you point out, having depended a lot on paper maps. When I was in the field, the officer was responsible for the weapon systems, basically the strategic things. The senior enlisted men would run the Marines. And so I literally, every moment I was in the field, I had a paper map in my hand with the thumb specifically on our location in case you had to use it for a quick call for fire or something like that. So I don't use Waze, but I do use GPS because that's kind of radio-like. It's fun gear.
When you navigate now around your home QTH and try to find the back streets, you know the back streets from the picture in your mind, not from Waze?
Yeah, I will, just like my experience teaching sailing, we emphasize the need to do a thorough chart reconnaissance before you head out in the water. And I'll do the same thing, not so much in my backyard here, but if we're heading out to visit sister-in-law in Kansas, I'll scan the map and get an idea of where we're going so that I don't completely rely on GPS.
And now this message from Icom America. Now, after you've cleaned up your holiday decorations, admired the colorful socks and ties from your well-meaning significant others, it's time to get what you really wanted on your holiday wish list. Spice up your ham shack with Icom's new ID52A handheld radio, now shipping. This radio is perfect for staying in or venturing out and working your favorite VHF and UHF channels this winter season. The Icom ID52A is Icom's newest handheld amateur radio that is VHF and UHF dual band with D-Star and FM dual mode functions. This radio supports conventional FM communications and D-Star, simplex, repeater mode, regional, and worldwide calls over the D-Star Internet Gateway. The ID52A is the first handheld amateur radio with a full-color 2.3-inch waterfall display and the ability to send photos over D-Star with a connected Android device. Other features include wideband receiver with guaranteed range of 144 to 148 MHz and 440 to 450 MHz. It has VV, UU, VU with dual DV mode, integrated GPS GLONASS receiver including grid square locations, micro SD card slot, micro USB for data transfer, programming, and charging, and it's IPX7 waterproof. Can you believe it? For more information, please click on the Icom banner ad in this week's show notes page at qsotoday.com. So get that new radio that was missed on your list. And when you purchase your new Icom ID52A or any other amazing Icom radio or accessory, please tell the dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. Do you think that kids nowadays that rely upon electronic media like Google Maps or Waze, for example, do you think that there's some, perhaps, cognitive in development that doesn't happen in terms of being able to picture your location against another location in your mind?
Does it stunt them, so to speak? I agree. I mean, it's just an experience they don't have. I don't think it's good or bad. It just is. And what I'm real happy to see, at least in my own family, is our daughter is a 25-year veteran kindergarten teacher. She's used to herding a classroom of little infants, and I get feedback from her of how education works. But both our daughter and our son, with the context that you just mentioned, try to emphasize extracurricular activities. There are limits to their time on the devices. There are limits to their time on the internet, and they emphasize sports and being outside with kids and that kind of thing. But to your specific question, I just think that's an experience they don't have. I'm certain neither of the grandkids have ever seen a map.
Yeah, I remember taking a globe to the grandchildren for the first time.
That's a funny-looking basketball.
But, to get a perspective in terms of how large the world is and where your place is on it, I think if you don't work with maps as a physical thing, then maybe you don't get that perspective. What do you think?
I took our nearby grandson into the shack. In fact, on my QRZ page, he's the little guy in the photo. And I turned around and brought him over we had spoken with some people somewhere in the world, and I walked him over to the globe and pointed out how far away they were, and he was mesmerized. So back to your original comment, I don't think it's that they're not interested. It's just not part of the exposure that we all grew up with.
I agree 100%. I think they're interested in everything at that age, and it's just, what's brought out for them to witness. Okay, so how long were you in the military?
25 years. Yeah, a little detour from my original plans of do a 3-year tour and get back into the classroom.
And what happened during that period of time? Were you deployed around the world?
I spent a third of that time away from home, deployed in the field on a ship headed for Norway, that kind of thing, a year in Okinawa. Fortunate for me, I'm still with my high school sweetheart because she was also an Air Force brat. So we became aware over time of sad stories right in basic training, Eric. I mean, we're 3 weeks into training and we hear stories where a couple split because the wife had no concept of what she had signed up for, married to either way, either the husband married to a military wife, etc. But about a third of that time I was away We had what we call geographical bachelors. At one point, we kept the family here in Virginia to maintain some stability for schools, et cetera, while I was about 6 hours away at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina.
When you're deployed as a Marine outside the United States, were you actually deployed on like an aircraft carrier or other kinds of ships?
In the Marine Corps, we were actually a subset of the Department of the Navy. We are close team members with the Navy, and they have an entire fleet of amphibious ships that are designed around Marine Corps mission. So we were on an LPH, which meant it was designed the H for helicopters. They had LPTs designed to get tanks across the beach, etc. We mentioned things that at the time seemed insignificant that were important later in life. The time I spent at sea aboard the USS Incheon actually counted for the Coast Guard to get my captain's license. That period was counted as sea time.
And did you spend some time in the Coast Guard?
No, it's just if you do anything for money, I teach sailing now, and if you are doing anything for hire, you were required to have a captain's license, just because there are passengers on board that more than just a recreational trip for the day kind of thing.
So it seems to me that after 25 years, you're a relatively young man when you retire from the Marine Corps. You're in your 50s or late 40s?
That was my first retirement.
Your first retirement. So what happened after that?
My next retirement was from AT&T. I ended up here in Northern Virginia in the government systems portion of AT&T, a Fortune 50 company, and I inherited the Navy account where my team and I supported Navy bases. At the time, this would have been in the late 90s. The Navy was installing T3 circuits, very high-speed, large circuits at the time. It might be nothing more than what we have for fiber into our own homes by now. But at the time, it was very high-capacity data circuits so that they could do wargaming and have conferences base to base like we're doing now through a kind of a immature Zoom approach rather than shipping people all over the world to get into the same building. And I did that for 5 years. I stayed in the telecommunications after that, went off to Silicon Valley for a company making cryogenically cooled cell phone filters. And when you cryogenically cool a filter, instead of the normal wave that we are used to, where the edges of the filter are not as pure, a cryogenically cooled filter is what they call a brick filter with absolutely vertical edges to it, and it triples the receive capability of a cell tower. And so I was working with a group of about 70 PhDs. Myself, the human resource lady, and the director of sales were the only 3 people in that 70-person company that did not have a PhD.
And how did that make you feel?
Oh, I was fine. It was like being an interpreter. They were off in the labs explaining to me what they were doing, and I was off as the government sales rep explaining to people like DARPA and the Air Force what we could do for them. So it was great fun, and we had a good rapport. There was no, I didn't feel snubbed because I hadn't earned my PhD or anything like that.
Can we go back to T3 circuits for just a second? Now, I remember T1 circuits were 24 channels. What was a T3 circuit?
I believe it's just a factor of 3.
So it's like 256?
Yeah. They were just another interesting aside. This is all your fault, Eric. You're stirring up things in my history. So AT&T was a union company, and you would have thought once we sold the circuit to the Navy, we would just flip it over to the installers and life would be good. But I found out that even though I was the manager of the sales force, my real job was after we had sold it was to go over and camp out at the installer facility in Vienna, Virginia, and beg them to meet the schedule to get the circuit installed.
Anybody in technical sales, I think, has had this experience.
Yeah. I mean, they were all good people, but they were just so wrapped up in union red tape. I had been a union worker as a kid in college working for a carpenter, so I kind of understood when the, what did we call him? The steward would come around and tell you, you can't carry those 3 boards. And I said, oh, yeah, I can. He goes, no, you can't.
Right. There's somebody else that can.
Yeah.
They're higher on the pecking order.
Yeah, right. But AT&T led to the Silicon Valley. Another interesting aside was the company I worked for making these cryogenically cooled filters was called Conductus, kind of a scientific name, 70 PhDs, no surprise there. But to someone unfamiliar with it, it kind of sounded like something you would get immunized for that you didn't want to catch. And if I had been successful at selling to the Coast Guard, I don't remember the name, but somewhere this would have been during my time at Conductus. So that was, again, the late mid-90s. The Coast Guard revamped their entire coastline communication system because of a tragic accident off the coast of North Carolina where, because they couldn't hear what the father and their 3 sons were talking about, they perished. And that led to a total refunding from Congress to revamp the communication system. And we had the solution. You were always going to hear the 100-watt signal from the shore-based Coast Guard station. The problem was you couldn't hear the 25-watt signal from the boat, and our little filter would have tripled their receive capability. But back to my story about Conductus, my competition was a little name that you might remember called Motorola, and people were much more familiar with Motorola than the word Conductus, and so I lost that contract.
Because of the name.
Yes.
Motorola probably sold them a whole bunch of receivers that went along the coast.
They sold them the whole thing, transmit, receive. And I remember having a conversation with the Motorola rep. Nice man. As you can tell, he won the argument.
Well, Motorola owns Israel as well.
I did not know that.
They've been here since 1963, actually.
Well, like when I was finishing up my tour in the Marine Corps, I was at one of the computer centers, and the saying was, you'll never get fired by buying IBM. So it's kind of the same thing with Motorola, I guess.
It's the same thing. You can't make a bad decision there. Okay, so let's go back to ham radio. So you were first introduced to ham radio when you were in Okinawa, and we're getting into Mars. How did you find the Mars station? Was it pointed out to you? I've had guests in the past that have said that they stumbled on the Mars station, or they knew it was there, but how did you find it?
You remember the scene from the movie The Wizard of Oz when it converts to color?
Right, at the very beginning.
That was my experience walking into the Mars station. The world turned to color. It was just dreamland to me. The floor-mounted Collins equipment, all the dials and the buttons, the magic of sending a signal 6,000 miles to my wife. I was bitten hook, line, and sinker. And shortly thereafter, I had an order in for a Heathkit HW101, the old hot water 101.
It seems to me that as a guy in your station in the Marines, that you'd seen fancy equipment before. So what made this equipment come into color?
I was in the infantry, and we sort of joked that we got the Army hand-me-downs. We didn't have a lot of. We were still using Jeeps, Eric, from the World War II era, and keeping them alive with chewing gum and baling wire, as we used to say. The only equipment I'd been around was the man-packed VHF radios. So
the bridge of a destroyer or something like that, comparatively speaking, you didn't have those experiences yet. This was your epiphany moment.
Right. I often look back wishing, which is never healthy, but wishing I had some of the perspective when I could have taken advantage of my time aboard the USS Incheon or been to the Division Comm Center, but I just hadn't been exposed yet.
So what happened after that? Did they say, oh, yeah, well, you could operate this equipment if you had an amateur radio license?
No, I continued to walk up at about 1 a.m, which would have been noon the day prior to my wife in Texas because of the international dateline. And while they helped us communicate, I wasn't operating anything. I was, for the nights that I was in at the base and not out in the field in night training, I was busily soldering away my Heathkit for the year in Okinawa. I also took out a correspondence course. I want to say ITT, but that's probably not right. But it was a course in electronics. So by the time I got back to the world, as we said, the Heathkit was all soldered up. I had learned more about power and power stations and transformers than I did RF. But, it was a good base of information. and I got back with this. This is kind of a fun story. I was this was 79 now, right when Zenith had bought up Heathkit, if you recall. So I went off in search of why my Heathkit didn't work. And to his credit, the technician at Zenith isolated the issue, troubleshot, and fixed it while I stood there in the lobby. And what it was, after, what do you think, 3,000 solders on this Heathkit? One of the potentiometers, you can visualize the little guys that have like 10 or 11 little feet that go through the circuit board. One of them had curved up instead of poked through, and so I missed that solder. But to his credit, he troubleshot that, found it, and fixed it. So this was the year I was going to amphibious warfare school. I was back in Virginia now, having returned from Okinawa. And again, I'm so bit by this radio thing. I went back to him weeks later and said, is there any way I could get a job here working after hours if I have time to do it? And he gave me an interview on the spot. He said, okay, let's see what you know. What would you do if a customer brought in a radio that didn't work? And I thought for a second. I said, I'd plug it in and see if there was any power coming out of the transformer. And he said, you're hired, which is not a high watermark for the Zenith store, is it?
It's a high watermark for most people that are trying to troubleshoot some kind of electronic device. Well, I think that's very interesting. But at this point, you still don't have the amateur radio license. Is that right?
About then, I was trying to remember how I got a 6-region call. And I think what happened is I finished up my year in Okinawa. Everything gets shipped. I'm now moved from Camp Pendleton, California, out to school in Quantico, Virginia, and I'm off to Baltimore. This was back before they had the, I forget the titles, where you had the field guys helping you get licensed and all. You had to go to the FCC field stations. And I believe the requirement was you had to give an address in which you had at least a year of residency. Does that sound right?
Right.
And since I was new to Virginia, I didn't have that, so I reverted back to my Camp Pendleton address. And so shortly after I landed in Virginia, I had Kilo Alpha 6 Hotel Whiskey Oscar, which was almost a vanity call. The HWO was almost like the HW 101.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. Okay, so you have this new license. You have this budding career in the military, and you built the HW101. What did you do with the HW101?
Boy, when you're young, you can just do terrible things to your body. I would be in school during the day for amphibious warfare school, and at night, after the kids were tucked in, I was Morse code with the 15-meter dipole in the attic, talking to guys working an oil rig in the Black Sea, like all of us did back in the wonderful sunspots of the 80s. And just tapping away Morse code. I got within 2 worked all states during that time. My career, fortunately, had a lull of, I mentioned that I was in the field for about a third of my career. When I came back from Okinawa, I was a year in school, and then I was 2 years at the Pentagon working in the White House liaison office. This would have been President Reagan's era, where I was one of 4 writers in the Pentagon answering military mail addressed to the president, and I got all the Marine Corps stuff. Got some funny stories about that. But it provided some downtime where I could actually be home for about 4 or 5 years in a row before I went back to the fleet.
Well, why don't you talk about that time in the Pentagon? What is the most interesting story that you can tell where you won't have to kill anybody?
It was just all mundane things. One of the funniest ones I remember is, 2 quick ones. I was a captain in the Marine Corps, but a captain in the Navy is much more senior. So the first thing I would have to do when I called down to a base to research a problem that some citizen had written into the president about, I would have to say this is Captain Chip Lohman at the Navy White House Liaison Office, and they would immediately assume I was a very senior officer. A Navy captain is much more senior, so I would immediately follow with, "Oh no, I'm just a Marine captain." But one of the funnier stories was this lady was all upset because her son had gone through boot camp almost the entire time with no boots. And so I'm having to call down to a Marine Corps training depot, Parris Island, and say, "I'm sorry to bother you with this, Major, but I've got this letter. Can you find out about PFC Banats and what the story was on his boots?" And he tells me, he said, "Oh, you're talking about the guy with the size 15 shoe size." So they had to special order boots for him because of his big feet, and they didn't come in till he was almost done with boot camp. So it was, the one thing that was very interesting that happened during that period is, you remember the Navajo code talkers?
Sure.
President Reagan got them awarded during I had nothing to do with it, but he created the recognition for them during my 2 years at the Pentagon, which would have been 81 and 2. So that was kind of fun to see those guys get recognition because of their native language. Nobody could understand what they were saying, and it was just a natural cipher.
They were used during World War II as a way to have a back channel that couldn't be broken by the Germans.
Precisely. And and the interim was all that time in between before they were finally recognized, thanks to President Reagan's tenure.
I remember that, and I think that's a great story as well.
Well, we did have K4AF, the Pentagon amateur radio station, which I was a member of. And another little side story, for the people in that time that drove around the Beltway around D.C., if they looked over to the Pentagon and saw this huge rhombic antenna, probably assumed that was some super spy 3-letter agency antenna. In fact, it was just the Amateur Radio Club.
Well, were there a lot of amateurs at the Pentagon when you were there?
I ended up teaching the novice class, and I think there was a class of 3 or 4. So I'm guessing we had a membership of under 20, maybe.
How many people are in the Pentagon?
I could only guess.
Thousands?
Yeah.
It's a huge building.
Yeah. Originally designed to be a hospital and then converted in time for the war to house the Department of Defense. Yeah.
Chip, were you self-taught, or did you actually have any mentors or any ham radio mentors that might have helped you?
Self-taught. During that year of Okinawa, the Mars guys were very helpful in talking to my bride, but there wasn't a mentorship situation. During the time when I got back and was still in school, I learned how to program in BASIC and created a little company called Ham Data Company, where I was creating software. You'll remember the VIC-20 and Commodore 64.
Well, as a matter of fact, I had that on my questions here. You appeared to be a very early adopter of computers. Many hams were in the 80s.
Oh, it was a natural. Yeah, it was. I created CW Practice, which was easy. Somebody had shared the algorithm for the MUF, maximum usual frequency. So I incorporated that. If you just give me a beginning and an end, latitude and longitude, I incorporated his algorithm to produce a little MUF chart. Now, given this is a dot matrix printer, Eric, so you can imagine sort of the underwhelming results that you get out of this thing.
You have to put that in the context of the times. It was pretty amazing.
But really, and everybody has had this experience. I was in Quantico, Virginia. I found a gentleman up in Arlington that had, remember the Trash 80 computer? Uh-huh. Well, he had a little program to write labels from my cassettes. So I would jump in whatever little vehicle I was driving at the time on the weekend, go up there and get pay him to print labels, if you will. Nowadays, any 10-year-old can do that with their Mac, but those were the days. And what really helped was the programs written in BASIC were not only editable, which was never wise to give customers something that they can monkey with, but they were slow. And at some point, I found a compiler, a little board that stuck on the side of the Commodore 64 that would reduce, I think it was about 7,000 lines of BASIC into a tiny little compiled program, and that was much more appropriate.
So you were an entrepreneur at the same time that you were in the military?
Well, yeah.
Was it a hobby diversion, or was it, honey, we need a little bit more money?
Oh, it was hobby. Well, I did buy our first sailboat with that, not because that was my goal, but thanks to the help of the precursor to Ham Radio Outlet, our local ham radio store in the 80s was ultimately bought out by HRO and became part of that franchise. But I wasn't an entrepreneur. I think like a lot of us, if you have an interest and no money, your choice is to do it yourself, right? And there's only one choice, so that's not a hard decision.
What interests me here, Chip, is that you become involved in amateur radio because of Army Mars. You build an HW101, which at the time was clearly a single sideband rig, although of course it did CW, and yet you became a CW operator.
Well, again, I couldn't afford an amplifier. I just, and the other reason, Eric, was if you think about when I was playing with the radio, everybody else was in bed. So rather than me yelling out, say again over, I could just quietly work the paddle.
That's a good reason. When you were there at the Pentagon, were you active in Mars then? Were you actually doing calls for servicemen overseas?
We did phone. We would sign up to volunteer a period of phone patching. We began to support the Marine Corps Marathon every October through that club. And another little segue into that, if you recall the days of getting your 2-meter brick from Radio Shack with the little fake leather cover. So I managed to get that working so that I could go over, and so basically we were the communication link, like Aries is today. We were the communications link for the marathon. And at one point I said, well, let's work this so that I can go mobile. And all I managed to accomplish with that is every time I would key up, it would shut the car down. You kind of learn, like I said, without any money, you learn by the pinball method of just bouncing around until you find out what works.
Now, you have sailboats. We can talk about those a little bit, but I also came across an article in Electric Radio Magazine, February 2020, where you wrote an article called Boat Anchor Magic. What was the magic in the Boat Anchor Magic article?
You're a good researcher, Eric.
Well, I get Electric Radio Magazine. That also helped.
So the HW101 in my QRZ photograph is not the one I built in Okinawa. In a moment of nostalgia, after retirement number 3, which we haven't talked about yet, I went out and found one. A young lady's in Texas dad had passed. He was a silent key and ended up with this radio. And by researching and calling around, it turns out a ham here in West Virginia, W3HM, Whiskey 3 Hotel Mike, Howard, is an internationally known radio restorer. And so that article was my reflections on the wonderful mentorship of Howard. He's normally fixing gold dust twins, very rare Collins equipment. And he pulled me under his wing and said, sure, little grasshopper, I'll fix your little Heath kit for you. And I was taken by that and wrote the story about that experience.
And the boat anchor is the HW101. I think it's great. In the restoration, does it look new?
Oh, it's better than new. That same group is my 80-meter Sunday morning rag chew. And I was brought in by Howard because we're in the extra class portion of the band, but they all build and repair and restore for a living. So just to save face, rather than firing up my Kenwood TS-890, I often use the Heath kit for that Sunday morning greet, just so I can rub shoulders with fellow tube radio aficionados.
And it's good to know, actually, that in your part of the world, there's actually a cadre of hams that can actually restore the old gear.
There are, and if I don't want to steer you in a direction, but I have some thoughts when it's appropriate of where we are with that, all of us with a little snow on top, as they say, gray hair, and what that bodes for the future of our hobby and what we should be doing with youth, et cetera.
Well, I'll get there, I think.
Okay.
What is the current rig?
When I came back to the sport, the hobby, I had purchased a Yaesu 757 GX back in the 80s, thinking I was going to put that on the boat. That never worked out. And so I had this unused brand new Yaesu that I announced to my bride that, hey, I don't have to spend any money to get back into the hobby. I had this new radio. What it turned out, sitting on the shelf for 30 years was not good for electrolytic capacitors. Every one of them was bone dry, flaked off when I took it down to the radio shop to find out why it was dead. And so that led me into a line of Kenwood radios. I got a used 590 for a while, and then I am now using a TS890 as my main rig with the Heathkit next door, and with a goal of going back through the worked all states, but this time with QRP. I have a little L-Craft KX3 that I can pack up and throw in a trailer on the times that we're out camping.
Do you do that a lot? And what do you operate? Do you operate CW on the KX3?
Yes. Again, everybody in the trailer is asleep, so my choice is to use the paddle.
And what's the antenna on the trailer when you're out there?
I have evolved. I now use a inverted V bazooka only for 40 meters. That seems to be a good all-around solution. I started off trying to pack all the stuff that I had here, a multi-band, etc. I also learned to beg for forgiveness rather than ask for permission with the camp manager. The first time I asked him if I could put up the antenna, you could just see the litigation wheels spinning in her head. And so now I just put it up, and I have a little American flag on the MFJ telescoping pole, and everybody just assumes that the wires coming off of it are guy lines, and nobody bothers me.
Well, you know what? This idea of it's easier to apologize than ask permission is a universal meme outside of America.
You and I know I'm not going to hurt anybody with 5 watts, even though I got the ends up 10 feet. But and it works out. Another little quirk is most people don't want to be in the trees because, as you know, it's not camping anymore. It's glamping as people set up their dish antenna to receive 500 channels, etc. So they prefer to be out in the open. And when I ask for a campsite over on the edge with the trees, it's an easy, they're happy to do so. And that allows me to get my wire up into the trees.
All right. When they have their Starlink internet dish, now for sure they're going to want to be out in the desert rather than in the forest.
Yeah, with their T3 connection to back home.
Their gigabit Ethernet connection.
Yes. This is camping. Fire up the propane fireplace and let's experience the wide outdoors.
Well, you know what? I think that also works with your neighbors as well. Thanks to Alex, who is a frequent visitor to the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, speaking about detecting earthquakes with radio signals.
Would that be VLF or?
He believes, and seems to prove it every time, that there is a reaction in the ether when there's earthquakes on the ground. So I just tell people that, I've got an earthquake detector.
There you go.
And we live on the Judean Rift, above the Judean Rift Valley here.
Have you experienced any quakes while you're out there?
I have, and it sounds like a train running through your yard.
Yeah, we're lucky here in Northern Virginia. We're not near any big faults. There was one in the 30 years we've been here. This is when you know you're retired, Eric, when you've been out longer than you were in. But we've been in this house for 30 years, and there was one quake during that tenure in southwestern Virginia, and then that's it in my experience.
What kind of boat do you have?
The 32-foot Erickson sloop, meaning one mast, and the classic inverted V look, mainsail and a big jib out front, purchased from a U.S. Airways pilot who took good care of it, but it was in tears when he met us at the broker's table to sell it because in between marriages, that had been his home, and his new wife wanted to be a trailer-only family, and so that's where we picked it up in Tampa, Florida.
I remember the Erickson from the olden days.
Pacific Seacraft bought their molds, and then that finally went the way of the dodo bird.
What kind of radios do you have in it?
That's a sad story, and to update you, I just sold the boat about in November, and that's what paid for we had been renting trailers, which wasn't the best financial setup, but it did allow us to buy what we wanted without buyer's remorse. We had the experience of renting, but in order to pay for that, I sold the boat. And the one remorse I have is I was poised to do some experimenting with antennas because the antenna used on a sailboat is a terrible, terrible compromise where you take the backstay and you put an insulator above and below the antenna, which is about 30 feet long, and you attempt to cover everything from 2 meters to 20 meters. And so you have a very warm antenna tutor eating up SWR, and they're just terribly inefficient. And I was hoping to experiment with using the forestay and basically creating an inverted V, but I'm going to have to come back to that project in the future, I guess.
Or you could do it on somebody else's boat.
Well, when you go and cut their forestay, you better know what you're doing.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. Now, you said you had the third job.
That was the NRA.
We talked a little bit about it before we started, that you were involved in the magazine business.
I had a good friend that I knew from way back at the Pentagon days, and I wasn't handling retirement very well. I was, as the country western song says, I wasn't ready for the rocking chair yet. And I ended up in the NRA, National Rifle Association. And most people, when they hear that, they know of the lobby group. That's not where I worked. I worked in a 60-person publications division where we put out all the member magazines. I began as the youth programs advocate, where my job was basically the ambassador to 2 million youth shooters in 12 different groups, DeMolay, JCs, Boy Scouts, Future Farmers of America, etc. And I was the spokesperson for NRA, offering them education, resources, sponsorship, trying to help their youth shooting programs. And my experience with youth programs got me invited over to be the editor of Shooting Sports USA magazine. And in addition to having lots of practice writing and being observed by 60 other people every time I wrote something, pointing out my grammatical errors, etc., the good part was I got to interview a truly special breed of people, and they're national athletes. I'm assuming most sports do this, but the folks that I met that were national shooting sports athletes were just very centered, balanced people. And I talked my boss into saying, I'd had experience shooting in the Marine Corps. I'd been a sniper instructor and had some experience with long-range shooting. And I said, boss, if I was actually on the line competing, I'd have much better access for these interviews. And he bought it. So for 8 years, I actually got paid to go to the national matches and compete. And then I would scramble around and catch people before they left for the day to do interviews.
How did you do?
I'm intermediate. I was an expert in the Marine Corps, but that barely gets you into the match with their skills. For example, I participated as an editor in what it had been the 2016 Olympic trials. That upright every 4 years.
Yeah, that sounds right.
16. I was out there in Ohio, again, not there because of my shooting skill, but because of my editor credentials. And just to be able to walk the walk, I was there shooting a 10-meter air rifle. And when you ask me about how well I did, the folks that are winning those are firing a 4.5 millimeter pellet at a target the size of a dime from 10 meters. And the ones that are winning never missed the dime. So to answer your question, I was just there to observe.
So you did that for what? Did you say 8 years?
8 years. In the end, I guess because of perfect attendance, I got promoted to the Deputy Executive Director of Publications, the number 2 guy sort of managing the shop while the boss was out selling advertising and converting us from paper to digital. But and then that was my third retirement in 2018. And now I am more than ever before involved daily with Mars and amateur radio.
And do you like retirement?
I do.
As a guy who's always been moving around?
It's a transition. I don't know if you've experienced it or not, but it's a transition from a very structured, here's what we expect of you environment to creating your own goals, if you know what I mean, creating your own structure. And that took me a little while to figure out. But thanks to Mars and amateur radio, I used to write as a ghostwriter for a couple years after I left NRA, but I became so out of touch with the daily routine, I finally had to recommend that we stop that because I just wasn't current anymore. But between an occasional writing assignment and amateur radio and a very forgiving wife, it's worked out.
I hear a lot of retirees say that they're more busy in retirement than they were before retirement. Is that what happening to you?
My one-word theme for life these days is balance. And yes, you're right. If you take the reins off, you can just run at 100 miles an hour. But my wife and I turned 70 just before Christmas, so I try to maintain some balance. One thing that you said in an earlier interview that I've really taken to heart is setting aside a block of time each day to do something. You recall that interview?
Well, I've asked it a number of times because I find that the people that are the most successful actually put that on their calendar every day.
And that's thanks to my little cell phone calendar. I need to do that. I can't claim success yet, but my goals of QRP, going back to the Worked States as a 5-watt station, learning, getting better at CW, dusting off my CW skills. I don't have traction there yet until I create that slot of time you talked by. But overall, I'm happy with the retirement once I made the transition. I've often thought about going back down to the Marine Corps base and offering to do a little seminar in retirement because I wasn't prepared for it. You're used to having the pedal all the way down, feeling very competitive. And if you're not getting ahead, you're falling behind kind of mentality. Transitioning to retirement takes a little bit of effort, but I feel comfortable having made that transition.
Well, I think that's a fine idea, Chip. I don't see myself retiring.
No, I don't recommend that.
But I do see that there are people that don't make that transition very well. Maybe it's because they don't feel they've got a destination the day after they're retired, that destination that gets them out of bed or, gets them to move around.
There was a book written by 7 wives of sailors, and they were liveaboards. They spent their whole life on the boats. At some point, I guess they retired. And one of the wives, it's one of these statements that just ended up being branded into my brain because I resented it at first. But she said, well, the women are doing fine, but, the men just identify with their work. And the inference was they were sort of lost now that they weren't working. But looking back on that has some truth to it. Some people, when you ask them who they are, their answer is what their daily employment is, and they don't have any other self-image than that.
When we were growing up, you're a little bit older than I am, but I remember, the average age, the average mortality age in the 70s was 67 for males. And I recall the people who were contemporaries of my parents. They worked hard right up to the day that they retired, and within a year or two, they were gone.
Good point, yeah.
I was wondering whether it was their careers maybe defined them, perhaps their companies wore them down in the last number of years, trying to get them out before they had to pay a pension that their employee earned and probably deserved, of course, but that there was nothing else that was defining these men. And so they were gone in a couple of years. I'm wondering what's changed. The average life expectancy now, I think, in Israel, I think, is 81 for men. And maybe it's gone down a little bit because of COVID in the United States. But what do you think has changed that has extended the longevity of adult males after retirement?
Well, life gets easier, right? We're not out manually tilling the fields anymore, that kind of thing. Do you think our emphasis on health has improved in the last 20 years? We're a little more health conscious, perhaps, on diet, fewer people smoke, that kind of thing?
Oh, that's an interesting idea. On the one hand, on the other hand, I think one of the reasons that the United States has the highest morbidity from the COVID-19 is the majority of the people who've passed away had 4 comorbidities, meaning that they had heart disease, they had high blood pressure, they had diabetes and stuff. So maybe old people are more in tune to walking every day or to doing exercise that they didn't do before. I don't recall my parents ever exercising. So maybe it's part of that. Maybe it's people say, well, you know what, if I'm going to enjoy the grandchildren, I'm going to have to walk more.
Well, you bring up a good point. We have pet dogs. They never take a break. They're going to be walked twice a day, come hell or high water. And so Pam and I are out on 2 40-minute walks a day, and that's got to be a big part of what you're saying, yeah.
I also have dogs. They're up at 6 o'clock in the morning, whether you like it or not, right?
Yeah, and, not to get too sentimental, but there's just the effect of having a little pet that is playing by a set of rules that are 3 million years old. They have a code, and you're either their friend or you're not. They don't lie. They don't cheat on their taxes. It's just a good balance in life, I think, to have a pet, my opinion.
Didn't Harry Truman say that if you wanted a friend inside the Washington Beltway, you had a dog?
Good point. Yeah. And we met a lot of new pet owners during COVID, right? I don't know if you saw that, but
Right.
yeah, and hopefully they're not ditching their pets now that they're going back to work. But yeah.
Well, I hope not either. What do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio now?
What's the saying? Planting your seed corn for the next season. I went to a Radio Shack a year or two ago to get some parts for a circuit on my boat. I needed some resistors and a little potentiometer. And the young man in the Radio Shack looked at me like, I'm not really sure what you're talking about. There's a bunch of stuff in the back, but I can sell you a Sprint cell phone if that's what you're interested in. So that transition of do-it-yourselfers, I need parts, is already fading. And so an emphasis on youth is something that I think about. When I was in youth programs at the NRA, I thought about that daily. And what I did there was to get youth involved. I went out to each of the 12. So the finish line on this is to get young amateur radio operators involved more. And as a parallel, what I did at the NRA is we went out to each of the 12 youth groups and said, would you, if we paid the fees, if we covered the expenses, would you nominate a national ambassador representing your youth group for 12 months? And they all said, sure. And then I went to the manufacturers and said, look, for pennies, if you'll pay for one trip a year to the National Trade Show and 2 trips a year to the NRA, we can have this group of youth walking around national trade shows with a bunch of manufacturer logos on, reminding people that they are a significant part of the shooting sports community. And we got them to be involved normally on the phone in the various shooting committees. So the rifle committee, the pistol committee, the black powder committee now had a youth member that they didn't have before. And they were required to write 2 articles in their year of tenure for a magazine. And so the general theme was to inject the youth perspective into our decision making. And it's still going on now. It's called the National Youth Ambassadors Association. My people that followed me kept it going. And I wonder if that's not a model that we're already using. I think ARRL's done a nice job with their the new magazine, On Air, is it? I think, yeah. The young woman who edits that, I think, does a wonderful job of dumbing down what we've learned over 30, 40 years into something that looks encouraging to a new technician.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
I'm no longer politically oriented. I'm not up with all the latest FCC plans and spectrum planning, et cetera. I like the public service aspect of it. That's alive and kicking. Mars integrates with ARRL races and the Department of Defense. I'm a member of Aries Local, and we're out in the wee hours of a Saturday morning supporting runs. So I think a segue to that, staying involved with public safety, we become prophets of the hobby, so to speak. I've often thought about when I'm sitting at a campsite working CW, should I be wearing a T-shirt that makes me sort of a walking billboard for the hobby, so to speak?
I think so. I think even having some kind of a QSL-like card, when you're doing soda or doing it in the park or something like that, that there's something that you could actually give to somebody that they could take home and maybe scan it with a QR code on their phone so they could actually get to the ARRL site.
Do you charge for this service, Eric? Or I'm going to plagiarize the heck out of that.
I don't see that we do marketing very well sometimes in amateur radio.
That's an interesting point, not to stretch out too much, but even in the shooting sports world, when I talk to these national champions, I said, part of you owe the sport some time with these youth shooters, the people that are standing in the line watching you, that are 40 feet behind the firing line. It's kind of like the NASCAR racer that goes back to sign autographs. You owe the sport some of your time to go interact with these people. And I wonder if that's not appropriate for us as well, instead of just huddling up at our hamventions and not looking for opportunities to integrate with our local communities.
I think Field Day is that opportunity.
Absolutely.
Get on the air station, things like that. So
can't miss it here. We're right on the main road.
I've had some guests in the past. One of the stories I'd heard that a young man was interested in amateur radio after spending a whole day on a GOTA station at an ARRL Field Day site. And his mother kind of squashed it by thinking that the whole thing was too expensive. So the marketing thing that you have to have is to respond to in your FAQ that you give out is ham radio is not expensive to get on the air. Maybe because we now have cell phone parts that we use in amateur radio that because they're produced by the billions are so cheap that we can actually build radios now for practically nothing.
Well, you sparked a thought. I'm great with other people's money, right? But in the shooting sports world, we created a match in a box. It was a big crate with, 10 air rifles, a whole bunch of targets and pellets. An air rifle is not a firearm, so there's no involved with licensing and all that stuff. And we would make it, that was part of my job in these programs, to make sure youth organizations be aware of this match in a box. I wonder if you could, at a club level, amateur radio club level, create little, what do we call them now? The go boxes, kind of like you're saying, designed to be QRP, hopefully somewhat destruction proof. Here, we'll loan you this kind of like a library, this go box for a period of time, and without spending any money, go have fun.
I think it's a great idea. I think that's maybe what's missing, though, Chip, that a club could actually assemble like a QCX, because maybe you don't want to give it like a QRP Labs QCX to someone who's never soldered anything before, but that you could actually have some to loan out. But what you also need is the mentor to go with that, to put up the antenna and say, this is how we do this, because I think that QRP could be very frustrating for a new ham that doesn't have the Elmer, either to encourage them to kind of keep at it even though it's difficult, and just to do something simple like throw that antenna over the tree.
I think you nailed it. Without that continuity, it's not going to work, right?
I think we all need our shooting instructor.
Well, what we need is a patch. For every 10 kids you mentor, you get another patch to show off.
Like the Boy Scout uniform. Do you have advice for newer returning hams to the hobby?
Yes. Break out the books. In the 30 years when I went back to the fleet after my Pentagon job and came back, there were two major changes that I was taken back by surprise with. A lot less use of the repeater in our area and a lot more use of digital, thanks to Joe Taylor and the FT8 and all those things to keep us going to the low sunspot level. The digital caught me off guard, and I've actually gone back and got some extra class DVDs to listen to because there's so much changed. Even though I kept my license current, I was behind the power curve when I came back to it.
In other words, what you're saying is break out the books or the YouTubes or the blog post articles or whatever that will update you on what's new in ham radio.
The YouTube is a fantastic resource as long as you can filter out the BS, if you know what I mean. You can pretty much tell, especially in the area of grounding. Don't go to YouTube to learn about grounding. But Jerry Ellsworth, David Kassler, Kevin Laughlin, Julian White was on your show recently, Tamitha Sculv, the space weather lady. That is a tremendous resource. And my wife is an early to bed person, and those are my evenings, is to cozy up on the couch with one of our dogs and watch YouTubes for an hour or so.
And, of course, Ward Silver was a guest on one of the early QSO Today podcasts. And if you want to know about grounding, then Ward has been doing a number of presentations. He even did one in the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo on grounding. So that's a good place to go.
The other thing I will share from, you asked about my observations having returned to the sport, the spirit of mentorship and helping did not diminish at all. When I talked to Paul Hervnack at Palstar or Bob Young at Tar Heel, Bob Young, to give you one example, when I wanted to put a mobile rig in my truck, I really didn't understand what people were referring to as grounding the truck. And the founder of Tar Heel, Bob Young, explained, well, you're really creating a capacitor between the truck and the ground. And so here's how you do the grounding. And he spent an hour with me as I ran around under the truck, visualizing what he was explaining to me, helping me learn how to properly ground a vehicle. And I ran into that often. Dan Bateman down at Buckmaster Antenna, Mike Aretsky over at Rig Expert, extremely unselfish with their time. So kudos to them.
Chip, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I have a new appreciation for a career military guy and the changes that one goes through in their lives, that you're able to recreate yourself multiple times in order to stay on track, learn new things, interact with the world in a positive way. I think that that's really cool. And with that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73.
Thank you, Eric, and I want to congratulate you. I think of you as the ancestry.com of amateur radio, so thanks for keeping it alive.
Thanks, Chip. I really appreciate it. That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Chip. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in NN4U, that's Nancy 4 uniform, in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item at the top of the page or any of the Expo logos in the show notes for updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. The presentation list is building, and the keynote presentation will be fantastic. Be sure to check it out every week. My thanks to Icom America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of Icom America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.